Okay, welcome students to your cell theory notes. This is our first interactive notebook entry for this unit LS2. So this is pretty much going to be an overview of not only what are the three parts of the cell theory, which is why I kind of split this into two different sides we're going to put here. What are those three major parts? But over here is going to be a timeline. Generally, how did we get to our knowledge today? It was a contribution of hundreds of different scientists. We're only going to focus on a few. So make sure you've got your notebook open and that you're following along with me. I am going to start really in the year 1665. There were developments in, we call it microscopy, which means a development of just putting lenses together and making things look bigger. That scientists did way before this, but this is the main date that we're going to talk about because this is when the term cell first came up. It was coined by a scientist named Robert Hooke. Robert Hooke, what he did was he looked at all kinds of things. Actually, he has an entire book called Micrographia. If you get a chance to look it up, it's still in publication today. It has some really cool images that he drew of what he saw. He really used just a series of lenses together inside just a tube. So it was a pretty simple microscope. You'll see a picture of it later on in this video. But he looked at cork, which is just really a dead part of a plant. It's like the bark of a tree. If you look inside it, you will see cork. It's also, if you've got a cork board at home, it's a bunch, he saw a bunch of little boxes hooked together. It reminded him of cells in monasteries where the monks used to live, really sparse, kind of empty rooms. So he said, I'm going to call what I see cells. So he was the first word who coined the word cell. So he gets credit for that. So I always think Robert Hooke, cork, cell, way back in the 1660s. After that, there were a lot of scientists who kept working on the microscope. There was a guy named Van Leeuwenhoek, Anton Van Leeuwenhoek, who was the first one to see living creatures. He looked at pond water and different things like that. He saw little protozoa, basically protists. He called them animalcules. But we're going to kind of zoom ahead, really a couple of hundred years, all the way down to really the mid-1800s, 1838, 1839. And I'm never going to ask you to memorize exact dates. I just want you to get a context for how long it took and how much these scientists really worked together from before Hooke all the way up until these two guys. These are two German scientists who have really fun names to say. First we have Schleiden, and then we have Schwann. Okay, what they did was, one, they had a much better microscope, clearly, than Robert Hooke. That was when they started using light and really multiple lenses. You'll see a picture of Schleiden and his microscope in a little bit. But Schleiden was more of the botanist. He studied plants. So he looked at countless samples of different plants and saw a very similar pattern, that every plant sample he looked at were made up of cells. Schwann did the same, but he was more of a zoologist. He studied animals. I always remember Schwann like a swan. A swan is an animal. But they really worked together to really come up with the main two tenets of the cell theory, which are all living things are made of cells, and that cells are the basic unit of life. No matter how small you get, plants and animals are all made up of that basic unit of structure and function called a cell. Now, they still didn't know as much. They still thought that cells formed from something called free-form formation, kind of like crystals, that they didn't come or they didn't divide. It wasn't until really not too long after a lot of discussion, studies, that a scientist by the name of Virchow came along who said, no, cells don't just free-form like crystals. Cells divide. So cells come from other cells, or we call it pre-existing cells. Now we know, well, duh, of course, cells divide. We're going to learn about that later in the unit. But it wasn't really until 1855 and a lot of studies, a lot of observations, that we came to that, which is the third and final part of the cell theory. So these are just a few of the players in this development of the cell theory. We are still going today, right? Our microscopes have gotten so much better. At the end of this video, you're going to see some images from a scanning electron microscope, which was developed in the 1940s, where we can really see super detail, things that are even as small as the diameter of an atom. So on this side, we're going to write the 3 parts of the cell theory that you're going to have to know. And remember what we talked about, what a theory is in science. It's not just an educated guess. It's been tested over and over again by multiple scientists and multiple observations and studies. So the very first one, okay, number 1, and there's no particular order to this. That is a terrible one. But as long as you know all 3, the first one is all living things are made of cells. So cells, every single thing that is alive, from a unicellular bacteria to a multicellular elephant, are all made of cells. The second part, and this is really what Schleiden and Schwann saw, and really Hooke too, but he didn't know that quark was alive. The cell is the basic unit of life. Cell is the, I got ahead of myself, sorry. Basic unit of life. It is the building block. So if you think about a Jenga game, or if you think about a Lego set you're building, the cell are those individual parts. It's the basic unit of structure and function in all living things. Now sometimes the cell, if it's a unicellular organism, is just one cell. But for example, for us, all multicellular organisms included, the base unit of life is the cell. So that's the second one. The cell is a basic unit of structure and function. And the third tenet is the one that Virchow added, okay? So this took a little bit longer, maybe about another 20 years, but now we know this to be true because we see cells dividing actively all the time, that all cells come from other cells, or often we call it pre-existing cells. They divide to help us grow. They divide to help organisms heal wounds, repair, all kinds of different reasons that they divide, but now we know, and we're going to learn about that later in the unit. It's called mitosis and meiosis. Okay, so go ahead and make sure that you have all these notes written down in your notebook. Make sure you do your left side. Remember, your left side is your creative side. So it can be a cartoon, another flow chart, some drawings, a poem. You go for it. Okay, it just has to be in color, and it has to be about the cell theory. Okay, so and then make sure you snap a picture and attach it to your assignment. So next, enjoy some pictures and some images from some microscopes over the years.